Genossen und Genossinnen, deutsche Arbeiter. Wir haben bewiesen in diesen 3 Jahren, dass wir ein Volk sind, das bestehen kann vor den anderen.
When Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power in 1933, they began building the largest forced labour system in Europe since antiquity. Some 26 million people across 20 countries had to work for the Nazi regime, including 12 million in Germany. Without forced labour, the German war economy risked collapse as early as 1941. Somewhere between 400,000 to 600,000 Czechs also worked in Germany and the occupied territories.
Každá rodina měla ve svém okolí někoho, kdo tam byl.
Ježišmarja, tady je to piano, na který já jsem hrál.
Among them was my great-grandfather, Miroslav Ježábek. Last year, I retraced his journey to understand what life was like for Czech forced labourers and other national and ethnic groups persecuted by the Nazis. Sanctioned by the state and sustained by German industry, forced labour played out alongside the Holocaust in full view of the German public. So why is it that this major crime against humanity is almost forgotten today? The Nazis occupied the rest of Bohemia and Moravia in March 1939. They seized the country's leading global arms industry to boost their own economy and armed forces, but the invasion ruined the Czech economy and caused widespread unemployment. The new occupation regime promised young Czechs better work opportunities if they migrated to Germany. By June, tens of thousands had left Prague for the Third Reich. Trained as a mechanic, Mirek Ježábek volunteered for Reich service in 1939. He worked for 6 months at a concrete company before moving to a bus manufacturer in Dresden. But Czechs were not the first group to be targeted for employment. The Nazis had coerced German and Austrian Jews and Gypsies into performing forced labour since 1933. They also invited privileged guest workers from Allied and neutral countries to work in Germany, which included Vichy France, Hungary, Romania, Slovakia and Italy. Poland became the target for an intense recruitment campaign. The Nazis hoped to convince the Poles, like the Czechs, that their circumstances would improve if they went to Germany. This rarely proved to be the case in reality. The Czech response to this scheme might seem unusual, but the voluntary nature of their employment is highly suspect. The Nazis stole and refused to allocate raw materials to the population, forcing many businesses to shut and more people to become unemployed. And anyone who failed to register at the employment office risked losing their social benefits and food stamps. So working for the Germans soon resembled the only viable option for Czechs confronted with poverty. It was a decision that would one day return to haunt them. Voluntary recruitment didn't prove as popular as the Nazis had hoped, and their tactics became more aggressive as a result. Polish and Soviet civilians and POWs were rounded up and deported to the Reich as early as September 1939. Victims were packed into cramped, filthy cattle trucks and freight trains. By 1941, Hitler had ruled to put any idle prisoners captured on the Eastern Front to work. But around 2 million POWs had already starved to death due to the German invasion. 3 primary groups of foreign labour operated in the Third Reich. These were prisoners of war, concentration camp detainees, and foreign civilian labourers. The latter formed the largest group, making up almost 26% of Germany's entire workforce by 1944. Mirek fell under this label as a mechanic. There was inevitably some crossover between these groups, but distinctions must be made between forced and slave labour. The year 1942 marked a crucial turning point in the war. Until now, the Nazis had sustained their policy of European colonisation, known as Lebensraum, by relying on voluntary recruitment and German troops returning from blitzkrieg operations in Western Europe. But their failed march on Moscow caused them to become locked in a brutal war of attrition with the Soviet Union. As more Germans enlisted to fight, the country's native workforce was dwindling. German women were initially considered to fill this significant labour shortage, but the state feared this would undermine their role as dutiful Aryan mothers and housewives. Instead, it turned its sights to employing foreign labour, declaring a total war economy. Hitler appointed 2 senior Nazis to oversee this enormous undertaking. Albert Speer was a prominent Nazi architect and a close member of Hitler's inner circle. He became the Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production in February 1942. His new role expanded upon his earlier duties under Organisation Todt. This paramilitary organisation had deployed forced labour for various construction projects since 1933, including Germany's Autobahn and the Atlantic Wall. To serve the Greater Reich, Speer would require huge numbers of labourers, and Hitler had just the man to help him do it. Fritz Sauckel became the General Plenipotentiary for work deployment in March 1942. He had been a loyal party follower since 1923. Between them, these men would bring untold suffering to millions of innocent men, women, and children. Any German business considered vital to the war effort was allowed to stay open and made extensive use of forced labour. Forced labourers worked in agriculture, construction, private households, church organisations, and in arms production. They worked alongside ordinary German citizens, though the latter always received more senior positions to enforce this social divide between Aryans and undesirables. In his new role, Sauckel imposed mandatory deployment for all Reich subjects. This included the 1 million foreign workers who had already arrived in Germany voluntarily. Mirek Žábek was fortunate enough to have returned home for a brief period before his total deployment began. Other workers saw their contracts revoked whilst they were still serving in the Reich, and they were barred from returning home. Entire age groups were called forward. Born in 1920, Mirek was among the first group of Czechs bound for Germany.
Jedná se o mého tatínka, který se narodil v květnu 1920. Když začala válka, tak bydlel v Hradci Králové, byl v obchodě. A jelikož byl to ročník 1920, tak byl totálně nasazený do Německa.
Narodil se v roce 23, nebo 1923, to znamená v rámci nucených nebo totálně nasazených prací, ať jeden nebo druhý výraz, tak byl de facto povolaný až v druhé vlně. Ročník 1923, kde byl děda, tak byl povolaný až v polovině roku 1943 do totálního nasazení. Byl zaměstnaný na Slezském předměstí, tady u nás v České republice v městě Hradec Králové, na jatkách, v masokombinátu a dělal tam řezníka, kterým se předtím vyučil.
This is where Mirek Žábek's journey as a forced labourer began. It's from many towns and villages such as this that up to 600,000 Czech men and women were deported for work in Nazi Germany. That might not seem like such a big statistic, but when you consider that in 1940 the lands of Bohemia and Moravia only had a population of over 7 million people, that means that every 1 in 10 people were being sent for forced labour. The Nazis also deported a few thousand Czechs to Norway, and an even smaller number made it as far as the British Channel Islands. Unlike Czech Jews and Gypsies deported to ghettos and concentration camps, most Czechs were conscripted. Workers reported to their local employment office, where they were medically examined and assessed on their professional skill set. They then signed a contract, produced exit papers from their state authorities, and received their workbook. This contained basic personal information with sections to be completed by their future employer. After this, they boarded special passenger trains at an assigned date and time, and were responsible for reaching their instructed destination. The Nazis deployed Mirek Žábek to the East German town of Saalfeld on the 29th of November 1942. He arrived here a day later. This scenic medieval town, nestled on the banks of the Saal River, hosted at least 1,500 foreign labourers by 1944. Upon his arrival, Mirek reported to the local employment office. Workers also stayed in transit camps and requisitioned public venues until their workplace was determined. A forced labourer's pre-war profession was not always considered, but Mirick's was. The employment authorities assigned him to a car sale and repair shop called Autohaus Grill, where he serviced military vehicles. We know that Mirick Lejarbeck spent at least some of his time in Salford living in this building over here, which was formerly a hotel. That was until he was eventually moved to premises closer to his workplace, which were owned and inhabited by his employer, a Mr. George Grill. Georg Grill died many years ago, but his business is still run by the same family.
Georg Grille war mein Urgroßvater, ist dann seine Tochter, hat eingeheiratet Rudolf Koch, so ist dann in Koch gekommen und das war dann mein Großvater wieder, der die Firma dann mal übernommen hatte, dann der Vater und jetzt ich. Ja. Da gab es irgendwelche Beschlagnahme von einem Haus hier hinten und was jetzt auch nicht mehr steht, aber wer und was, das weiß ich.
The Czechs held an unusual middle ground in the Nazis' strict racial and ethnic hierarchy. Hitler resented the Czechs, as did the man he sent to govern them. Reinhard Heydrich was named the acting protector of Bohemia and Moravia in September 1941. Privately, he plotted to eradicate up to 2/3 of the population following a German victory in the war. Czechoslovak paratroopers had other ideas. But surprisingly, the Germans also viewed the Czechs as being an educated, urbanised and German-speaking people. They became known as nationals of a special kind, sharing a similar legal position with most Germans. But in practice, they always remained second-class citizens. While some lived in private accommodation, others stayed in forced labour camps under the General Building Inspector for the Reich Capital, headed by Albert Speer.
Ještě jinak, od prvního dne pracoval přímo na jatkách, pracoval přímo pro masokombinát v Drážďanech. On už na tom příkaze tak měl adresu, kam se má dostavit. Oni je nedoportovali tam, oni se museli dostavit sami. Takže on se dostavil do Drážďan, nevím jak dlouho, ale říkal, že chvilku byl v táboře, ale to nebyl koncentrační tábor, ani vyhlazovací tábor. To byl tábor těch arbajťáků, těch jenom jako hlídaný tábor. Tak tam byl chvilku a pak už zůstávali vlastně v tom masokombinátu, který měl svoji vlastní ubytovnu, svoje vlastní ubytování pro dělníky.
This former camp is the only preserved example of the 3,000 built for more than 420,000 forced labourers flooding into Berlin by 1944. From here, labourers either worked in arms production or were rented by nearby private firms, the cost being deducted from their own wages. The specially constructed barracks mixed genders and nationalities. Living conditions were primitive and overcrowded. Stealing and disease became common, with no isolation for infected workers, and the Slavic subhumans from the east suffered the worst. They were scarcely clothed in all seasons, and women would prostitute themselves just for a piece of bread. Interestingly, the camp remained unguarded, since the authorities reasoned that no foreigner would ever make it far before being recaptured. Being hungry, overworked and homesick soon resembled daily life for all forced labourers, who were entirely at the mercy of their employers. They survived on meagre rations and worked 10 to 12-hour days, sometimes longer. While Czech rations tended to match those of ordinary Germans, Eastern workers endured the poorest conditions, the lowest wages and the smallest rations. In a postcard he sent to my future great-grandmother in 1942, Mirick writes that he and his colleagues spent Christmas Eve hungry and were in bed by 7 p.m.
Pak mě ještě vypravoval, že tam, kde byl, tam údajně se dělali zákopy, ale o tom nechci mluvit, ale že tam byli lidi, co byli totálně nasazeni a říká, člověče, večer tam přivezli valník za traktorem, plný valník mrkve. Ráno tam nebyla jedna mrkev. Všechno ty lidi snědli, protože byl hlad. Jo. Takže vůbec nevadilo, že to bylo z pole, že to nebylo umytý. To vůbec nevadilo. Ty lidi měli hlad a prostě snědli cokoliv. Že?
Mistři a ty zaměstnanci, ty fabriky těch jatek jako takových, tak je brali jako rovnocenný lidi. Naprosto, dokonce jim dovolovali brát si maso, což neexistovalo, protože to bylo maso pro válečnou provenienci, tam se bouralo maso pro Wehrmacht. Takže co se týče i v případě dalších otázek, co se týče hladu, tak tyhle ty chlapy na jatkách hlady netrpěli, měli masa dost. Nesměli to vynášet, nesměli to prodávat. Nicméně děda vždycky říkal, že ty, co tam měli, ty zaměstnanci těch jatek, tak se k ním chovali velice dobře. A s ostatníma, s Wehrmachtem, s SSákama, s tímhletím oni nepřicházeli do styku. Protože to byla fabrika ve prospěch válečné výroby.
Mirik received this payslip whilst working in Saalfeld. First and foremost, it confirms that forced labourers were paid, unlike slaves. For working a 50-hour week, Mirik earned a gross salary of 3750 Reichsmarks, with a net weekly income of 3123 after deductions for income tax and health insurance. Health insurance only covered treatment for minor illnesses lasting for a period of up to 8 weeks. Workers needing further treatment were sent home. The average German worker earned 44 Reichsmarks, while the average Eastern worker earned 5. Therefore, Mirik's earnings could suggest a link between a Czech worker's earnings and their racial status. And supporting this theory are the harsh discriminatory taxes imposed on Poles and Eastern workers, which left them with little to no income at all. Food rations and earnings did increase for these groups from 1943 to boost their productivity, which was even more crucial after D-Day, but these improvements rarely manifested in reality. On the back of this payslip, Mirik sarcastically writes, "Look at all the riches we are bringing in." High inflation rates in the occupied territories and the Reichsbank's refusal to re-evaluate the Reichsmark meant that any funds a worker transferred home were significantly devalued by unfavourable exchange rates. The bottom disclaimer reads, "Complaints must be made immediately." Czechs maintain the right to complain about their wages to their national representative in Germany, who would escalate their concerns to the state authorities, but how common or successful this was in practice is unclear. Meanwhile, Eastern workers did not receive sickness pay and were excluded from all forms of labour protection, and slaves reserved no right to complain about their work at all. But while working for the Germans was hard enough, living under Nazi rule would not be any easier. Less than a month after arriving in Saalfeld, Mirik wrote home to my future great-grandmother saying how he and some acquaintances had visited this cosy cafe, today a youth club. They are playing "I Love You My Most Beautiful" just for us, he writes, their favourite song at the time. German-speaking Czech, Dutch and Flemish workers could visit shops, cinemas, theatres and play football, but whatever relative freedoms Mirik enjoyed, he was faced by constant reminders of his status in German society. His last line reads, basically, a Czech isn't a human being here.
Ne, údajně tam měl dělat zákopy, kopat zákopy a na ty zákopy říká, Ježišmarja, já tady furt nebudu s tím korumpáčem kopat. Tak si dal údajně na zákopy harmoniku, protože i dobře hrál na harmoniku. Jestli byla jeho vlastní, nebo jestli ji získal, to já tam někde, to nevím. Ale někdo si ho tam všiml a vytáhli ho právě do tyhle hospůdky a pak tam hrál v té hospodě, tam hrál teda na piano. Takže už nemusel kopat ty zákopy tam.
Free time was a rarity for forced labourers confined to camps. This tended to be used to wash, sleep, and to seek further employment elsewhere, which promised greater access to food. Eastern workers were banned from using public transport, visiting restaurants, and were subject to a night curfew. In March 1940, the wearing of ethnic identity badges was made compulsory for Poles and Eastern workers, a year before the Nazis forced Jews to wear the Star of David. Czechs may have been spared this degrading social humiliation, but they could still incur severe penalties for various offences. These included stealing, sabotage, refusing to work, breaching their contracts, and fraternising with Germans. Workers faced imprisonment, deportation, and even capital punishment. The regime may have turned a blind eye to Nazi officers sleeping with Eastern prostitutes, but sexual relations between foreigners and Germans were met with serious consequences. Offenders faced public humiliation, consignment to brothels, deportation to concentration camps, and even execution. The same punishments applied to German men and women. More than half of the abducted Eastern and Polish workers were women, including girls aged 13 and below. Families of deportees tended to be kept together, but this did not always happen. In December 1942, Zalkal introduced maternity and childcare facilities to stop pregnant women from being sent home. In these facilities, women became targets for forced abortions. Suitable offspring were spared for Nazification in German households, but children considered unfit to work or genetically inferior died inside infant death camps. But despite such brutal punishment, resistance from labourers was rare. Some cases saw workers vandalise recruitment offices or railway lines. Czechs famously employed go-slow tactics as a form of passive resistance, wasting time on trivial tasks to delay their productive output. But the best chance for most labourers was to quietly work for the enemy and pray their day of liberation would come. But not all had a choice. Hidden in the Hungarian highlands, just 19 miles south of Saalfeld, is the Ottersbruck slate quarry. Forced labour had operated here since the start of the war, but this intensified from September 1943, when the Nazis established the KZ camp, codenamed Laura, an SS-run satellite camp off the Buchenwald concentration camp network. To overcome the increasing threat of Allied bombardment late in the war, the Nazis relocated their armaments factories underground, converting old tunnels and mine shafts. Life in these camps was very different to those run by Speer. 3 layers of barbed wire and electric fencing surrounded the camp, making escape virtually impossible. Tunnelling and construction were the most dangerous work for any labourer, but especially slaves. Living conditions were equally abhorrent. An existing barn housed almost 800 inmates. Here, inmates were tormented with roll calls and routine physical abuse. Another barracks, now derelict, previously housed Italian military internees. After Italy surrendered and joined the Allies in late 1943, the Nazis carried out brutal revenge against them. A staggering 650,000 Italian POWs were deported to the Third Reich by the summer of 1944. The Nazis converted these men to civilian status in order to avoid international guidelines concerning prisoners and work. Thousands died in captivity. The main task for forced labourers at Laura was building and testing the dreaded Nazi vengeance weapons. More than 4,000 V2 rocket engine tests were carried out from this site. These missiles killed thousands of civilians in England, France and Belgium, but tens of thousands of workers also died in their production. It is within camps like this that a glaring contradiction in Nazi ideology emerges. The Reich authorities were always at odds about the true purpose of forced labour. On one side there was Speer and Zalkal, who favoured economic expansion, but other institutions like the SS saw forced labour only as a means of punishment, racist repression and extermination. But as Laura shows, even the most ardent Nazis succumbed to economic reason as their hold over Europe began to crumble. Leave was the only legal way a labourer could return home without breaching their contract. But with many workers failing to return, Zalkal eventually outlawed the practice in March 1944. Mirick's postcards read more desperate during this time and show he even considered escape. Official records reveal that Mirick travelled between Germany and Bohemia at least twice in 1944, though his postcards suggest this number was higher. By early 1945, he was once again bound for home, except this time he would not return to Saalfeld.
Vím, že taky říkal, že přijel, jak se říká, na černo domů. To byl tenkrát trest smrti. A vím, že se ukrýval kousek od Hradce přes hradě na nějaký chatičce a že mu tam maminka nosila jídlo na tu chatičku. Pak se zase vrátil do toho Německa. Proč to bylo, jestli tady měl nějaký děvče, za kterým tím děvčetem jel, to opravdu nemůžu říct, nevím.
On měl nárok za 6 měsíců přijet do Čech na 3 dny.
On his journey, he encountered what remained of the city of Dresden.
In the greatest blitz on Germany, Allied airmen link up their attacks with Marshal Stalin's armies. British bombers head for Dresden, the Saxony bastion of the Nazis along the Eastern Front. And up comes Goebbels' newest secret weapon, a scarecrow, exploding like a plane hit by ack-ack. RAF Lancasters splashed 650,000 incendiary bombs on transportation lines in Germany's 7th largest city. They smash a big Reich roadblock across the Russian advance. Damage to Dresden, hampering the Wehrmacht, helps Konev's forces 70 miles away.
Takže on dostal v prvním půlroce, byl tady na 3 dny a vlastně v druhém půlroce, když si vyčerpával, tak shodou náhod cesta do Čech, ty 3 dny dovolený a cesta zpátky do Německa a tomu zachránilo život, protože to bylo na přelomu ledna února a v únoru byly Drážďany bombardovaný Britama a Američanama, kobercový bombardování a on vlastně, když došel v březnu zpátky, když dojel, tak zjistil, že jejich fabrika neexistuje. Takže se otočili, vrátili se do Čech a až do osvobození v květnu 1945, tak se vlastně schovával po známých a příbuzných. A jak je ta společná fotka těch 4 mladíků, tak ty 3 kamarády, kteří tam jsou na fotce, tak už nikdy neviděl.
Allied command deemed the bombing necessary to destroy key military targets, but considering the vast civilian casualties, many would still call their actions a war crime. Saalfeld endured its own share of Allied bombing. Besides racist abuse and infectious diseases, air raids posed the next biggest threat to foreign workers, particularly those living in urban areas. They were at greater risk of death, as they generally lived at their workplace premises and were barred from using public shelters. Substandard shelters and slit trenches offered workers in camps modest protection against shrapnel damage, but these would not withstand a direct hit. Forced labourers were conflicted about their situation. On one side, they welcomed Allied bombing, as this would mean a faster end to the war, but it also put them directly in the line of fire. British Bomber Command had conducted sorties against Saalfeld throughout the war, but it was the US 9th Air Force which carried out a major assault on the town on the 9th of April 1945. Before the attack, Zalkal commanded all garrisons to defend Fungaria at any cost. He fled south to Bavaria only days after giving the order. Fleets of bombers roared over the town, targeting its rich industrial quarter and railway station, a key transit point on the Munich to Berlin line. Bombers unleashed 1,300 explosives, killing more than 208 people, 7 foreigners among them. Mirick's workplace at Otterhaus Grill took a direct hit, destroying half the premises.
Großeltern mit ihren Kindern in dem Haus gewohnt haben hier vorn, hat einen Bombentreffer bekommen durchs Schlafzimmer und während die Familie im Keller Zuflucht gesucht hat. Und dort sind sie aber alleine auch nicht rausgekommen, sondern die mussten ausgegraben werden.
Georg Grill, his family and his workers all miraculously survived, but the nearby air raid shelter at Zaltor was not so lucky. A blast caused the shelter to collapse, burying all 38 people seeking refuge inside. 4 days later, what remained of the town's German garrison blew up the Saal Bridge in a vain attempt to delay the advancing Allies. But, sure enough, in the early hours of the 13th of April, American tanks rolled into the town. US forces arrived at Laura the same day, but to their surprise, they only found a few dead and dying inmates. The SS had already deported the remaining population to Dachau just hours before their arrival. More than 2,600 forced labourers worked at Laura, including 28 Czechs. By 1945, the camp had registered 600 fatalities. Under different circumstances, Mirik could have easily ended up in this camp, and his future would have looked very different. For Mirik and other labourers, it would seem a combination of his Czech nationality, his status as a skilled worker, and being a fluent German speaker all improved his chances of survival. Mirik managed to return home in 1945. We know he contracted tonsillitis during his enforced stay in Germany, which might explain why he was allowed to return home so late in the war. But after receiving hospital treatment, he refused to go back to Germany, violating the terms of his release. German records show his return to Czechoslovakia as being in June 1945, but my late great-grandmother maintained he had arrived home earlier and gone into hiding above the village cinema, today a corner shop. It wasn't until a recent surprise discovery that this mystery was finally put to rest. In a document Mirik produced after the war, he states his return as being in March 1945. And another revealing detail on the German counterpart reads, returned to CSSR in June 1945, according to a communication from the CSR committee. This suggests that Mirik did go into hiding, at least until Czechoslovakia's liberation in May. Only after this did he alert the Czech authorities to his return, who relayed this incorrect information back to Germany. It wasn't just Czechs hiding out in villages like these. Another Czech forced labourer sent to Saalfeld had fled Germany with a Ukrainian slave, but it wasn't the Nazis they were hiding from.
Jmenovala se Ksenia Avruckaja, byla to Ukrajinka, s kterou se manželčin děda seznámil při totálním nasazení v Německu.
World leaders met at the Yalta Conference to decide the fate of post-war Europe. One outcome of the conference was their decision to repatriate liberated Soviet citizens back to the Soviet Union. The highly secretive and highly controversial operation saw Allied soldiers round up and deport millions of former Soviet POWs and civilians back to Stalin, often at gunpoint. For many of these people, this decision meant almost certain death or spending their remaining days in a gulag.
Ty se vrátili de facto až to osvobození děda Šulců, protože se vzali se a děda Šulců dostal na výběr, jestli půjde s babičkou, anebo se s ní rozvede a pošle jí, protože babička byla deportovaná. Dostala na to rozkaz na deportaci zpátky na Ukrajinu, tak děda Šulců prodal veškerý svůj majetek, včetně rodinného domku, který tam nahoře měli, když dostali rozkaz, že pojede s ní na Ukrajinu. Nějakým způsobem deportace byla zrušená, ale jenom její, ne celý komunity. Takže neměli rodinný domek, neměli ani deku, měli spoustu peněz a neměli kde bydlet a zůstali v České republice.
Like most people in Europe, Mirik had inevitably sensed the war was over. Perhaps he had also learned of the chaos back in Saalfeld. Either way, there was no reason for him to return to a war-torn Germany, now besieged on two fronts. In doing so, he risked perishing in one of the many arbitrary massacres that became common towards the end of the war. And even if he had survived this, his repatriation from a displaced persons camp could have taken months. Mirik would one day return to Saalfeld, but for now, he turned his back on the town which had been his home for more than 2 years. The war was over, but justice for Europe's forced labourers would have to wait, and many would never live to see it.
We close the 20th century with an extraordinary achievement that will bring an added measure of material and moral justice to the victims of this century's most terrible crime.
The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg put 24 Nazi war criminals on trial. Proceedings lasted over a year. By their conclusion, 12 offenders had been sentenced to death, and several more sent to prison. The courts found Fritz Zalkal guilty of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. One US prosecutor branded him as the cruelest slave owner since the Egyptian pharaohs. He was executed in October 1946. Albert Speer was convicted on the same charges and sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. After his release in 1966, he published 2 memoirs. He maintained his innocence and denied all knowledge of Nazi atrocities, right up until his death in 1981. The trials had delivered swift justice to a handful of senior Nazi officials and industrialists, but they had failed to address the broader topic of forced and slave labour. Forced labour was seen as being a consequence of wartime labour shortages, and not as a specific Nazi war crime. Few people thought to question how and why millions of foreign workers had ended up in Germany in the first place. Over time, all physical evidence of their presence was erased. The split German governments suppressed claims for compensation on grounds of jurisdiction or expiration. Their years of suffering and abuse was being deliberately ignored. The Soviet security services treated returning Polish and Eastern workers with suspicion and contempt. Many workers who had just been freed from forced labour camps now found themselves imprisoned in gulags for allegedly conspiring with the Nazis. Former Czech labourers also faced political and social stigma on their return. After all, they were not war heroes or resistance fighters. There are no memorials to honour their suffering. At best, they were treated with complete indifference. The contempt directed towards voluntary and forced labourers makes little sense. As an occupied territory of the Third Reich, whether Czechs went to work in Germany or chose to remain in the Protectorate, they were inadvertently supporting the German war economy. So in reality, working for the Nazis was really difficult to avoid.
Veřejně se o tom v České republice minimálně do začátku 90. let prostě nemluvilo. Ne, že by to byl nějaký punc špatnosti, ale musíme si uvědomit, že v té době Česká republika, protože Slovensko byl samostatný stát, toho se to netýkalo, že v té době měla Česká republika 7 milionů obyvatel. Takže každá rodina v této republice tam měla svého příbuzného. Měla tam svého syna, synovce, vnuka, vnučku potom v roce 1944, protože tam už jezdili i ženský. Nebylo potřeba o tom mluvit.
The communist coup of Czechoslovakia in 1948 further sealed their fate. Former workers would be forced to carry the burden of their physical and mental trauma for decades, some for the rest of their lives. The looming Cold War brought increasing strain to East-West relations. Neither side was keen to address the issue of forced labour. In the early 1950s, the Soviet Union stopped processing claims for reparations from Germany, and the main interest for the Western Allies was rebuilding Europe. Fears of bankrupting Germany's economy, as they had done after the First World War, convinced Britain and America to prioritise reparation payments over victim compensation. The Allies signed the London Debt Agreement with West Germany in February 1953. This agreement eliminated half of West Germany's pre- and post-war debt of 30 billion Deutschmarks and made the remainder payable in instalments. This radical plan is widely credited with saving West Germany's post-war economy. Compensating forced labourers was to be delayed until the signing of a peace treaty. In essence, the Germans wanted to bury the truth, the communists punished the victims, and the West wanted to move on and forget the suffering of many millions.
Jeho přirozenou součástí se stalo dobře organizované studentské hnutí.
By the 1980s, the Cold War had finally ended. It was time to heal old wounds. The German and Austrian governments were coming under increasing public and political pressure to acknowledge all victims of Nationalist Socialist persecution. The year 1990 brought the reunification of Germany and the signing of the 2+4 agreement, the closest thing resembling a peace treaty. The struggle of forced labourers could no longer be ignored. And it wasn't just the new German government coming under fire. Campaigners, lawyers and journalists targeted leading corporations for their active role in promoting and profiteering from forced and slave labour. Threats of industry boycotts and class action lawsuits filed against German companies through the American courts forced the United States government to intervene and the German government to re-evaluate its stance on compensation.
I have just received a letter from Chancellor Schroeder confirming that the German government and German industry are prepared to commit 10 billion Deutschmarks, the equivalent of more than $5 billion, to a fund for those who were slave and forced laborers and suffered other injuries under the Nazi regime. Those who will benefit are elderly survivors, Sadly, they're passing away at a rate of almost 10% a year. Some are living here in the United States. Many are living in Central and Eastern Europe. Double victims who endured the Holocaust first and then a half century of communism. They have been waiting a long, long time, and nothing can fully compensate their searing loss.
We were less than slaves. A slave you're supposed to feed, and so he can perform work for you, but they didn't feed us. They wanted us to die because they sent other people in, and it was like a vicious circle. They killed more people, those companies, than the German government did. Hitler didn't kill 6 million Jews. They were killed by those companies.
I want to thank the companies involved in the settlement for acknowledging their moral and historic responsibility. I will do everything I can to provide legal finality for them and to remove the potential cloud hanging over German companies doing business here in the United States.
The German Foundation Act was passed, creating the Remembrance, Responsibility and Future Foundation in August 2000. Rather than appealing directly to the state, former labourers could process their claims through this bespoke organisation. The project was the biggest of its kind. It required hundreds of governments, labour organisations, archives and victim support groups to work together. The German government pledged 10 billion Deutschmarks to the programme. Half this amount was covered by private German companies. 540 million Deutschmarks were set aside for forced and slave labourers. The remaining amount covered persecuted Jews, property losses, insurance claims, kidnapped children, and victims of Nazi medical experimentation. The foundation worked closely with the International Organisation for Migration and the International Tracing Service of the Red Cross. The state entrusted these organisations with processing millions of compensation and pension claims, but they also faced the impossible task of locating further eligible claimants. Thousands of former labourers were now old, had died, or emigrated abroad. A former labourer's claim had to meet a diverse set of criteria to qualify for compensation. This included the length, type, and place of their interment. If eligible, workers could receive a one-time symbolic sum of up to €7,000 for all their years of lost income and personal suffering. The filing deadline for claims expired in December 2001. Repayments were completed by December 2006, and the scheme wrapped the following year. By this time, 1.7 million former labourers across 89 countries had received compensation, including 75,000 victims in the Czech Republic. While the programme succeeded in bringing long overdue recognition to their struggle, it came too late for many former labourers. Mirek Žábek's family did not apply for compensation.
No, jednou jsme se vraceli od toho Baltu domů přes to východní Německo. Zastavili jsme před hospodou, jakoby vesnickou hospodou. Koukal na tu budovu a teď ještě před tou budovou říká, to je hospoda, kde jsem hrál, když jsem byl totálně nasazený. Vejdeme do hospody, tam je dlouhá chodba. Na konci ty chodby vpravo jsou dveře. Tam byl sál a tam já jsem hrál na piano. Opravdu na konci ty chodby byly dveře. Otevřel ty dveře. Mírně se podíval vpravo a říká, Ježišmarja, tady je to piano, na který já jsem hrál.
The Nazi Forced Labour Documentation Centre opened at this former campsite in 2006. The centre, and other organisations like it, still receive thousands of inquiries every year from those searching for information on lost relatives. Governments and societies can always do more to keep the legacy of these victims alive, and they have a shared responsibility to ensure such atrocities never happen again.
Věřím vám, má nejkrásnější, a na návrat váš dál čeká. tak sám, vraťte se ke mně zpět, dřív než celý svět prohledám. Noci dlouhé jsou, když čekám a zpívám hvězdám nad hlavou. Věřím vám, že marně nedoufám. Včera jste byla ještě se mnou a dnes je všecko jen pohádkou. A kdo se loučil, snad zapomněl, že vrátit jednou se chtěl. Vzpomínat budu na krásný čas, vysvětluji celý, znamenal vás. Vás přivolá. Jsem tak sám, vraťte se ke mně zpět, dřív než celý svět prohledám. Noci dlouhé jsou, když čekám a zpívám hvězdám nad hlavou. Věřím vám, že marně nedoufám.